The proof is in the pudding, or in this case, in the steaming hot 41,000 hours of January 6th footage. Steve Baker joins me today to talk about what really happened January 6th and the fallout that changed his life forever. I am James Poulos. This is 0 Hour. Steve Baker is a lifelong musician and music industry professional, but his recent rise to fame wasn't the life-changing start every musician wants. He used to be a hobbyist political writer, but now he's a full-blown investigative journalist, where he's found himself in a bit of trouble following his coverage of January 6th. Let's get into it. Welcome, Steve.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me.
All right, so we'll get into the trouble in a sec. Just take us back to January 6th. Were you there? What did you do? What did you see?
I was there. I showed up with a camera, a microphone, a man-on-the-street microphone, a tripod, and my intention that day was to do some interviews after the rally at the Ellipse, where Trump would be speaking. And there was a feeling or a thought that there might be something released about the election controversy, obviously the quote-unquote stolen election that everybody was gathered to rally around Trump about that day. And to be honest with you, the speeches were a bit of a nothing burger, as they say. And myself and another writer that I had traveled up from Raleigh, North Carolina with, we made our way up to D.C. the day before and attended the speech and the speeches. And then about halfway through Trump's speech, we realized nothing was coming. So we decided to get ahead of the crowd and start moving towards the Capitol, because there were actual scheduled events there that day. There were other things on the listings and the social media postings and the flyers, that there were marches and protests and stages that were erected at the Capitol. So we wanted to get over there where the VIPs would be at, and then I would set up shop there and get some interviews, man on the street interviews and impressions about what was going on that day. By the time we got to the Capitol, well, everything had changed. It was about, I got there about 1:10 p.m. and this not knowing that there had been a breach of outer barricades. I didn't know that there was already violence going on by then. And that had happened about 12:52 p.m. was the first breach while Trump was still speaking.
So you walk into the middle of this, you see that all is not as it was meant to be.
Yeah.
Did alarm bells start going off in your head? Did you see things that were suspicious? What was the feel?
There was nothing suspicious in advance. Down at the Washington Monument lawn and at the Ellipse, it was revelry. It was, people were singing and chanting and having fun, and the flags, there was a 25, 30 mile an hour breeze that day, and thousands upon thousands of flags, and this sea of people were, so it was quite a spectacle. And then the walk over, there were a lot of people that had the same idea that we had. Plus, you wanted to try and get warm. It was biting cold with that wind. And so we were making a rather brisk 1 mile walk over to the Capitol. But by the time we were getting close, we started hearing sirens. And then all of a sudden I look up from, we were in the, what they call the Peace Monument reflection pool side on the west side of the Capitol. And all of a sudden I start seeing smoke. And then I start hearing flashbangs. And then I see the fluorescent vest of D.C. Metropolitan Police arriving down the stairs of the Capitol. And I looked over at my friend, the other writer that I was with, and I said, "That's where we're going." And we broke out in a run and went up to the West Terrace, and the battle was already engaged. So I started my camera at 1:19 p.m. and the first thing that I captured were both protesters and police officers receiving first aid.
So that's some pretty hot footage you got. What happened to that footage?
Well, the footage got used a lot. It was licensed to various news organizations. It's been in the HBO documentary, New York Times documentary, and several others, as well as news agencies have used it all over the world. That was the first thing that happened to it. And then, of course, more recently, fast forward 2.5 years, and I just got a grand jury subpoena for it, so I had to turn that over to the FBI just a few weeks ago.
Well, wait a minute. I don't understand. Since when is giving information to the New York Times a federal offense?
It's not supposed to be, but according to what the FBI told me and my lawyer back 21 months ago, they told me that I was going to be prosecuted for interstate racketeering. I'll let that sink in for a second.
Yeah, that's a new one, right?
Yeah, nobody else that we're aware of related to January 6 offenses, be it a journalist, independent journalist, or any other type of protester, peaceful or otherwise, that we are aware of, have been threatened with the charge of interstate racketeering. And the only thing that we've been able to surmise is that they want to charge me with I guess, the preconceived notion that I knew something was going to happen of an illegal nature, and therefore I traveled across state lines to get to D.C., knowing that an illegal event was going to take place and knowing that I was going to be able to profit from it as a photographer.
They must really have their work cut out for them coming up with evidence to prove that out.
Well, we don't think that they have that, obviously, and they, after the initial threat, because in November of 21, my attorney was notified in email by the assistant U.S. attorney by the name of Anita Eve out of Philadelphia, who has my case, and she had notified my attorney, and the exact quote was, "Your client is going to be charged within the week, and here's the statutes under which he's going to be charged," and that was one of them. We launched an immediate press and media offensive against this. I sent out press releases to news services of all sizes and all types. And then we started doing interviews, and we never heard from them again for 20 months until I received the recent grand jury subpoena.
Typical intimidation and lawfare. This is the way it works now, right?
Yeah.
And you're certainly not the only one, but this is just another egregious case on the top of the pile. So not only did you send out all those press releases, right, but you did not sit down, you did not go quietly. You're watching the tapes. You're one of, I think, 5 journalists who have been granted access. Why you? What's a nice musician doing in a place like this?
I snuck in. I literally backdoored myself in there. No, I had been trying to get in for some time because I had become. There's no other way to say it except, you know, that sixth sense that some investigators and journalists had. My dad was one of those, he was a private investigator who had that profiler's sixth sense. And I think I got a little bit of that. You know, I don't know if that's the right brain or the left brain or which side that comes from, but there was something that happened about a year ago that got me on the scent, as it were, of a story. And so I began working my way in and through the process in D.C., working with not only other journalists, but working with some of the think tanks, foundations there, working directly with congressional staffers, and slowly worked my way to where I was finally actually invited in. And that was after Tucker Carlson had been given access. It's probably a good thing to let everybody know that no one has been given all of this video. Tucker was not given the 41,000 hours worth of video, he or his staff. They were given access to 3 computer terminals in the Capitol, one of the Capitol administration buildings, where this has been made available. And it's not just been made available to a handful of journalists, but also to trial defendants, their attorneys, and other investigators that have been working on various aspects of January 6th. So it was Tucker, Julie Kelly, John Solomon, and then Joe Hanneman from the Epoch Times and myself were the 5 that were basically used as guinea pigs by the House admin staff to figure out how they were going to eventually release this to the media world at large.
Okay, you said something got you on the trail to start this process. Can you share what that is?
I can hint at it a little bit.
I'll take a hint.
Yeah. It was sitting through one of the trials back last fall in D.C., and there was a moment where I felt like that I saw something untoward or something suspicious happening between the lead prosecuting attorney, his name is Jeffrey Nessler, an assistant U.S. attorney, and Judge Amit Mehta, who was over sitting on the bench in this particular trial. And my antennas went up when I saw this, and they were pinging, you know, on the red side of the scale, and I started digging deeper and began to interview some of the attorneys involved in the case, the defense attorneys, and trying to figure out why that there was this moment of literal panic that I saw, body language, facial recognition, you know, just the...
In response to something
going on in the courtroom. In response, that was something that was brought up in the trial. And it was during that time that I was beginning to see what I considered to be suppression of evidence. And I actually believe that I was seeing a collusion, which is not supposed to happen, between the government and the judiciary, or the actual judge. I felt like I was actually seeing collusion between the two. And again, I had no proof of that at the time. It was just instinct. And then I began digging. And I did something that most journalists would not do, because it's a very dangerous process. But I actually, I remember I said I backdoored my way into the Capitol to see these videos, but I also backdoored my way into seeing some of this evidence that was under court seal. And you have to actually sign the court's protective order in order to do that. Well, if you sign the protective order, that means you can't write about what you've seen. So it's a catch-22. You get to know what's going on behind the scenes. You get to learn what's happening in sealed sessions. You get to see documents that are not being allowed into evidence, or videos that are not being allowed into evidence. But then you can't talk about it. But I felt like I had to know. So I signed the protective order, and then I was given access as a result of doing that to some documents that basically verified that what I saw in court was in fact a suppression of evidence that would quite likely be exculpatory evidence for these defendants. And then after the trial, and there were other episodes like that similarly that took place in that trial. After that, then I was full on. I was of one-track mind for the next 10 months. And
so they were suppressing the suppression.
Yeah, yeah.
This is why people think they're aliens.
Yeah, there's a literal cover-up of the suppression.
Cover-up of the cover-up. So you're digging, and you're now up to your elbows in this stuff. What have you seen, and what are you still looking for?
Well, I was finally given access to that video. I had 3 full days in there, and it's quite a daunting task because there's so much.
I'm sure.
I mean, you can't possibly see all 41,000 hours worth of this video. It would, I think somebody's done the math on it, you know, continuous viewing for 6 or 7 years, 24 hours a day just to watch that much video. And then in addition to that, there's 1,700 cameras inside and outside the Capitol building itself. So you have to know where to start. Well, because of what I saw in this trial, I knew where to start. So I had a little bit of an advantage. I also had seen these documents that had never been released, that are still under court seal to this day. So I also knew where to look. And then once I got in and started that process, now you got to put the pieces of the puzzle together, and you have to triangulate between cameras, and then you lose if you're tracking somebody in the Capitol down a hallway or up a staircase or you know, through doorways. You lose them because the Capitol is not 100% covered, so you lose them, and then you have to find them on another camera where they pop back out. So it's a tedious process, just that alone. But what I saw, to make a long story short, verified my suspicions from 10 months earlier sitting in the courtroom.
How much is there still in there to be seen, do you think?
It'll take, well, as someone said just recently, if they would release all of this video to the public at large, I think we could find, you know, 41,000 people that could examine an hour at a time, and we'd knock this out
in a
quickly.
day or two. That's right.
Right.
Yeah, okay. All right. So we'll get into the cases in a minute, but the impression that you're giving off is that these are extraordinarily weak cases. that if the evidence was discovered, open, out on the table, at least some of these cases would probably fall apart. Is that right?
I've been going out on a limb and being much more emphatic than it just being a weak case. I believe, from what I've seen, and what I have also showed other people, other investigators, other journalists that are friendly and know that this is not quite the time to release it yet until we have everything completely put together, that what we have discovered is not only suppression of evidence, but also the creation out of thin air of evidence that did not exist for the purpose of convicting certain, not everybody. There are people that did bad things on January 6th, and they deserve rightfully whatever punishment is coming their way based on the particular crime. But there are people who have been scapegoated, who have become the patsies, who have become the anointed leaders of the insurrection, so to speak, that in fact were not, and not at all, and that they have been falsely accused. And then the Department of Justice created evidence in order to convict them of their accused crimes.
All right, then let's just dig into it right now then. Who are these names? Let's hear. who are the guys who shouldn't be in jail and are right now?
I'm going to wait on that because this story, I've got about 2 more weeks worth of work. Thankfully, just in the last week, I have been given permission again from the House Administration Committee and the staffers there to go back in to the video room, and we're going to be able to take a couple of Blaze techs and reporters with me into that room, and that is scheduled, and we're going to be back in there this next week, and so I'll be able to finish this up, and then finally I can get this off my chest.
Vladimir Putin called the U.S. dollar's drop in dominance, quote, objective and irreversible during the recent BRICS summit in South Africa, as Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa formally agreed to use local currencies instead of the U.S. dollar. It's the first shoe to fall. As demand for the dollar weakens, the buying power of the dollar weakens. That is why Birch Gold Group is busier than ever. Investors and savers are looking to harness the power of physical gold held in a tax-sheltered IRA. Text James to 989898 for your free info kit on gold. With thousands of happy customers, an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, and countless 5-star reviews, you can count on Birch Gold to help you navigate transitioning an existing IRA or 401k into an IRA in gold. As the U.S. dollar continues to receive pressure from foreign countries, digital currency, and central banks, arm yourself with information on how to protect your savings. Text James to 989898 to claim your free info kit now. You think there are enough good guys up there in Washington that we can have some kind of a happy ending here?
I think that there are enough good guys that when this rolls out, they're going to scream bloody murder. They're going to finally demand congressional hearings about January 6th that will be completely different than the dog and pony show that Nancy Pelosi put on in her select committee previously, before the new Congress came in, and that they will want to dig deeper, and that they will be issuing subpoenas for these individuals who I will name here probably within the next couple of weeks.
This is projecting out a little bit, but you know, why stop now? We have such a massive security state right now, domestic and foreign and overlapping, and everyone's got their own intelligence agency. DHS, DIA, CIA, FBI, the list goes on and on and on. And DOJ, and, you know, FBI's got their field offices in all these different cities. If it comes to the point where mission accomplished, there are hearings, there's a real effort to get some accountability here. It's just so easy to imagine, you know, it's like the DOJ just sort of points over there and says, well, it wasn't us, it was the other guy. And the other guy says, no, it was like this is the third, you know. And you have all these different agencies and sub-agencies. And so it's really easy to sort of shift blame and just kind of disperse it all and find some flunky somewhere in there and say, oh, well, they made a clerical error or whatever. and just try to make it all go away that way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have at least a provisional judgment about where the buck stops or where the rot really started?
Well, I will tell you this, that the second article I wrote about January 6th was published on February 24th, 2021, just 6 weeks after that crazy day. And the title of that article was "Who Was Up the Chain on January 6th?" And at the end of the day, there were only two people that were responsible for the protection of the facility and ultimately what was allowed to happen. And those two names are Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi. Mitch had not turned over his reins to Schumer yet, so he was still in charge of the building. The two individuals that answered directly to him were the two sergeants at arms. The House Sergeant of Arms, name was Paul Irving, and the Senate Sergeant of Arms, the late Michael Stinger. And they both said in their own words and in their congressional testimonies that as everything was breaking out and Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund was calling in state troopers and trying to get the National Guard out, which took hours before they were finally released to him, that when he was calling the Sergeant at Arms and asking for help, they said, "We'll run it up the chain." Well, there's only one individual up the chain. It goes from Stinger to McConnell. It goes from Irving to Pelosi. So that's who we know they were running the chain up, running up the chain to. What we don't know is why it was allowed to get to that place in the first place. We have a lot of evidence of not only incompetencies, which is the first place you have to go when you're talking about government. Before you go to malevolence or malfeasance or anything nefarious, you have to go to the problem of government incompetence. And when you have a police force, the Capitol Police, that works for ostensibly the most incompetent government in the world, then you can easily start there. And you can start figuring out what were the failures that day? Why was the Capitol Police operating on about a fifth, maybe even as small as a tenth of their actual manpower, uniformed manpower? Why were there only just a couple of hundred uniformed police officers defending the Capitol that day when they had a uniformed police force of somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 available to them? Why on a major event day such as January 6th, which is by all Capitol Police that I've interviewed who say that that's an all boots on the ground day, why is it that at 7:30 that morning or 7 o'clock that morning when the shift change was happening, they weren't holding people over, as is the normal protocol for a major event day, to have their officers work 16-hour shifts rather than 8? Why were they sending people home? And then also, why did the officers that were on duty that day, why during their morning briefing, in their roll call briefings, why were they not even told that there were going to be scheduled events that had been licensed by their own department leadership on the Capitol grounds that day? They felt like that they were going to just have another day at the office. And we've learned that not only from testimonies of the officers in trials, we've learned that from whistleblowers who have come forward, and we've also learned that from unnamed sources. But we've also learned that even from Nancy Pelosi's House Select Committee, because in those interviews that they did with the Capitol Police intelligence analysts and their various department heads, that they had passed over, or not passed over, but they had passed up to leadership at the Capitol Police, which then must be passed up to the other department heads and up the chain, that there was going to be significantly violent events taking place, that they had the intel on that. And yet for some reason that information was then not passed back down to the frontline officers or their middle level command officers.
So, you know, like you said, don't want to put it past a government like this, but we're talking like maybe 10 or 12 layers of incompetence in both directions for something like that, to sort of the totality of the circumstances. Yeah. Is that plausible, that it's just all incompetence?
No, it's not. You can certainly find an incompetent individual in the chain of command that would have made such a mistake or didn't pass along to one particular division of the Capitol Police about what was happening. But what we have learned is that this information was held from all their divisions. And they have many divisions. It's not, look, the Capitol Police are often disparaged as being nothing more than just glorified tour guides with a badge, you know. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, if they're lucky, they spend most of their careers telling, you know, oh, yes, the restrooms this way, or, you know, a new congressperson that just gets elected, you know, this is where the lunchroom is, or, you know, whatever. But they certainly don't have the kind of activity or the kind of brouhahas on the Capitol with the frequency that the Metropolitan Police have, the D.C. Metro Police have out on the streets of D.C. And so, but they do have multiple divisions. They have their own SWAT team. They have their civil disturbance units, you know, the guys that wear the RoboCop-looking things. They have their own intelligence analysts. They have their long rifle teams that carry automatic weapons. So they have many more divisions than just that. And some of them are specialized and highly trained divisions. But for some reason, none of them received information about what was coming that day. And we know beyond any shadow of a doubt that not only coming from the FBI, coming as far away as the New York Police Department, this is testified before Congress, that the NYPD had their own intelligence and passed that information along to the Capitol Police, that there was trouble coming. They had intel coming from other regional police departments. They had it coming from the Defense Department. So there was just too many examples of that for this to be a breakdown, and then for none of that to be passed down to the officers. And then not only not passed down to the frontline officers, but had it even reached lower levels of command, they would have been able to prepare and have more of their troops on duty that day. And they just didn't have them.
Well, it was a big party, nevertheless. You think, you think CIA was on the ground that day?
CIA. Well, we'll never know if they were, would we? But I mean, certainly, look, anytime there's a large event, there's going to be operatives. They're going to be undercover. There were undercover D.C. Metro Police. There were undercover Capitol Police. There were undercover FBI. There were undercover U.S. Marshals in the crowd. There were also undercover special forces from the U.S. Army, which is a whole other story. And that's, of course, another investigation in my pile of things that I've been working on for the last 2 years. In fact, I was the first one in my second article, February 24 of 2021, to actually report that I had discovered evidence of a particular Special Forces unit that had been deployed that day into the crowd. And I said, I don't necessarily think that that was for nefarious reasons, but it does raise the question, why were they there? What did somebody know that needed this elite unit to be deployed in the crowd, ostensibly, as I said it in that article, to take care of business if business needed to be taken care of?
You think there were foreign operatives in the mix?
We know that there were now. We know that there were Ukrainian operatives. Now, what were they? Who were they working for? We don't know. But we know they're there.
Pretty early in the game for them to show up, huh?
Yeah, we have through facial recognition, we have them at the Capitol and in Ukraine.
Craziness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then you've got the targeted groups. You got Proud Boys, you got Oath Keepers. Some of those guys were not present, and yet they're still getting charged, and in some cases getting convicted.
Yeah, and it's important also for people to kind of understand the two differences, or the basic differences between those two groups. The Proud Boys proudly like going out on the street and knocking heads. Not initiating violence, but they don't mind finding where Antifa is and getting in between Antifa and whoever Antifa might be railing against, counter protesters. So if you've got BLM on one side and MAGA on the other side, and then Antifa comes out there to harass MAGA, then the Proud Boys like to show up to defend MAGA and engage. And that's what their reputation is and had been for quite some time. Oath Keepers, on the other hand, were the exact opposite. They've always taken the tack for the 13 years that they had existed before January 6th of preventing violence, standing in the gap, providing security for minority businesses that were being burned down during the BLM riots, or even going all the way back to Ferguson, Missouri, all the way back to there. They were standing on the rooftops of minority businesses with their weapons, and all the rioters had to do was look up on the roof and see those guys standing there. And you know, they were like the Passover. You know, nobody harmed those businesses. And they had provided that kind of security and that kind of protection for events all over the country. And so in 13 years of operation, the Oath Keepers had never had a single violent event that they participated in. Now, they were providing security in violent events, but they never engaged. They were never engaged. And they would have people that would come up to them. There's video. In fact, videos were played in the trial of protesters coming up and just shouting and cussing at them in their faces, and they just stood there and took it. Now, Proud Boy may not have handled it in the same manner that they did. But in 13 years, they had never committed a crime, never had a crime charged against an Oath Keeper, and hundreds and even thousands of security operations that they had engaged themselves in. And then all of a sudden, on January 6th, this all changed in one day. Well, that's what the government asserted, and called them the leaders of the insurrection. They were the tip of the spear.
The sayers of stuff.
Yeah, and of course they were anything but, because all of the initial breaches that took place happened before they were even on the grounds. They were still providing security. They were either sitting still in the Ellipse VIP section at the invitation of the Secret Service. Yes, I said that.
That's wild. And
then, or they were leading their protectees that they had been put in charge of, and that they were brought in for their security detail, as they had been in so many other events prior to January 6th. And they were walking them over from the Ellipse over to the Capitol, where a stage was set up and the PA was set up, and they were going to be, you know, giving more speeches and rally, and Congress members were going to be speaking on that stage. And these were all scheduled in advance. They were licensed, legally permitted by the Capitol Police themselves. And then by the time they got there, all hell had broken loose, and it all changed for them as well.
Yeah. All right. So you got this funky fact pattern here. What can we glean from all this as to why these guys are in the crosshairs? Is it they're trying to set an example, trying to make an example out of them? Is it just hoping to distract attention from some other group of people? What do you think is behind these really just extraordinary charges, extraordinary cases, you know, a decade, 2 decades of prison sentences for these guys?
This is the weaponization of these 3-letter agencies, and the darkness that's, you know, for some reason overtaken our system, our governmental system here, against groups that would do those kinds of things, because the last thing that this government wants, as it's moving us away from individual liberty to centralized control towards, you know, the New World Order, the Great Reset, whatever, you know, however you want to label where they're taking us right now. The last thing they need is an organization of tens of thousands of former law enforcement, retired military that have sworn to keep and continue keeping their oath.
Got to clear them out.
That's it. And so this was the opportunity to not only scapegoat them, and they, you know, they look the part. They wear the paramilitary looking gear, and And it was time for somebody to make an example of them. And as I wrote in my earliest articles about January 6th, is that this was the largest and most successful narrative victory by the progressive left in this country, at least in the last 100 years. I think the largest victory before that was probably the Great Depression, because then that led to the New Deal. It led to the implementation of so many of the social welfare programs that we have today, that began the process of addicting Americans to dependency upon the government. And it was the beginning of the progressive movement. Was really right there at the Great Depression. And so this narrative, I believe, was expected to be and could have been much worse. And this is corroborated by some of the whistleblowers that are coming out. You know, the Capitol Police themselves, almost to a man, believe that they were set up that day. And they not only believe that they were set up, if you talk to them, many of them believe that it was intended to be even worse. My earliest analysis was, I believed, and I actually wrote these words, I said, I believe that the Capitol Police were set up to be sacrificial pawns that day, and that I believe that whoever was up that chain was willing to sacrifice a couple of them had those MAGA people shown up with firearms and used them. Now, we know that a few had them, but none of those individuals drew their weapons and used those weapons against law enforcement.
Big tech and big data have shown us time after time that they're not on our side. And yes, we are giving them access to record our personal lives 24/7 through our phones. Even when your phone is off, the microphones and cameras and location trackers still work. And that's just the tech people. What about your personal security when it comes to the crazy ex, someone stalking you or even trying to blackmail you? It happens more than you might think. This is why I use the Refuge Ghost Sleeve. It's made in America, from American buffalo leather, and it blocks 5G signals that other Faraday sleeves miss, and the only Faraday sleeve that blocks signal and sound. They added sound blocking panels on each side that keep conversations private. This isn't some clunky metal box, it looks cool. It's easy to put your phone in and take out of throughout the day whenever you want privacy. You can't be too careful these days, and the Refuge Ghost Sleeve can help keep you safe. Visit refugeprivacy.com today. Use code ZERO to save 10% off your order. That's refugeprivacy.com. Promo code ZERO for 10% off. It's bad news. You know, I look at what's going on in the world. I look at the effect that technology is having on pretty much every major country in the world, and of course the minor ones too. And one of the big results is serious internal divisions. You know, Russia just went through some of this. China has been going through this for at least a decade, sort of power struggles behind the scenes. Israel obviously going through this in a major way, it's unprecedented in its history. And of course here in the US. It seems like there have to be some folks in the administration, on the left, generally speaking, you know, career civil servant types. They can't all be bad apples, right? Do you think that there is enough of a divide there where you've got folks, even Dems, even guys who've been around for a long time, folks who can't vote in or vote out, who really just know that this stinks and know that these guys are playing with fire? And if and when the moment arrives that you're describing, that this investigation proceeds, hearings, and it starts to open up, American people can see things for what they are. Do you think it's likely that some of the folks on the other side are going to peel off and are going to say, you know what, like this is a problem and this did go too far, and we actually do need to come together to fix it?
Are you asking me if I believe that there's still some good apples up there that maybe have a D after their name?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, maybe they've been keeping their heads down. You got guys who've been up there for decades, and they know where the bodies are buried. And I mean, they're just even looking at something like the war in Afghanistan, right? Yeah. Biden was like, no, we're getting out, hell or high water. I just don't care anymore. We're getting out. And that was very divisive. A lot of folks in the national security state, they didn't want that to happen. Right. A lot of those neocons who somehow managed to just wiggle their way out of the GOP and into the Dems, very unhappy with that. Yeah. There are these kinds of divides, and I wonder, you know, I wonder if there are folks in there in the administration, in the sort of the broader administrative state, who know that this is bad and know that it stinks and think that it's really not sustainable, and you know, maybe they just don't want to get burned.
I'll give you an overarching kind of universal answer to that question, is that in not only my investigations related to January 6th, but in discussions with my own attorney, who was a former federal prosecutor for 22 years. In fact, his first job back in the late 80s as a Department of Justice, attorney, well, U.S. attorney, was working as a in-house attorney for the FBI. And as he told me, he goes, I worshiped those guys. I mean, it was everything that we used to think about them. They wore the white hats, they were the good guys. And he said, when we would sit at the table and we would look at cases, we really were looking at justice. We were looking for justice. We weren't looking for a crime for crime's sake to get a notch in our gun belt. And he said, but that began to change. At first was accelerated by the implementation of the Patriot Act after 9/11, and then it really hit high speed when the Obama administration came in, because that's when, as he clearly stated, that they were going to fundamentally transform this nation. And that's when the decapitation of all of the three-letter agencies began to happen, and they began moving the white hats out. Those who had been there for years and had worked their way up as one of the good guys into leadership, they began to move them out and replace those basically with political operatives and those who were activists in the progressive movement. And now we are looking at an era where the active agents, the field agents, are guys that have been in for 10, 15 years, and they've all came in after this transformation, this fundamental transformation of America had already been initiated. And so these new guys that are out there that are making and doing these SWAT raids, with few exceptions, we know about the whistleblowers like Steve Friend and Kyle Seraphin and a couple of the other guys that testified before Congress in the Weaponization Committee hearings recently. These guys are guys that have that conscience, believe in their oath, they know what the law is, and they refuse to follow orders, and they filed to become federal whistleblowers. And of course, we know how our government is treating them now, even though they've gone about the process correctly. But going back to your question, are there any white hats left in leadership? I don't know, man. And if they are, what are they waiting on? Are they waiting to get their 20 in or their 30 to get their pension at the right level? I was talking to Kyle Seraphin a few weeks ago about that, and I proposed this idea to him, something that I'd heard bantered around in conversations that I've had over the years, was that all of this wave of good guys that came in response to 9/11, well, 9/11 is now, it's 22 years ago. So they came in, they went to school maybe studying law enforcement, and then they graduated from there, and then they went to and applied for the FBI Academy, that sort of thing. They went through that training, and then they got their jobs. So now these guys are all coming up on their 20s, They might be 5 years away, they might be a year away. And I said, are we going to see a wave of good guys that once they get that pension secured, they're going to all come out and say, all right, I'm one of the good guys? And Kyle said, if they wait 2 years, they're not going to have a country to retire into. And he said this, and I give them no quarter.
Yeah. So he doesn't see them as waking up one morning and going, gosh, I better say something, even if it's going to ding my pension.
A guy like Kyle and like Steve Friend, they had a specific incident that happened. They said, I cannot do that. That's a violation of our protocols. That's a violation of the law. That's a violation of our department standards. That's a violation of my oath. And that was the moment they said, I cannot do that. And then they faced the repercussions of having taken that stand. And we know that there are so many others that are doing this. I mean, this is not an isolated incident that J6ers, misdemeanor, people, what I call the accidental tourists that day in the building. Look, everybody that went into that building that day is not an insurrectionist. I know that the grassroots left want to paint all of the thousands of people that were on Capitol Hill at large, or were just in D.C. that day at large, were insurrectionists, and that's just not the case.
Well, just the footage that most of us have seen, it was almost like a photo op, sort of people just smiling and waving and milling around.
Well, you would have had to been there to understand. You could be as close as 20 yards away from actual violence that was taking place and have no idea because of elevations, because of the crowd size, the density of the crowd. People are singing and chanting, and you would have no idea that something nefarious, untoward, or dangerous was going on. And then if you were further back, all you could see was, again, thousands and thousands of flags in the air, and you could hear the chanting and the song, and then all of a sudden, crowds start moving forward, and then you get a little bit closer, and you look, hey, honey, the door's open. Yeah. They didn't see how the door got open. They didn't know that people had actually broken windows, jumped through those windows, came in and unlocked those doors, first on the west side, then the east side, and then they opened up. I think the Capitol. We'll put this to rest as well. I think there were 7 different breach points into the building that day, and I'm sorry to tell everyone, but having seen what I've seen, having access to the evidence that I've seen, the Capitol Police never opened one of those doors. There was never a time, as has been alleged. This is an unfortunate rumor that persists 2.5 years later, that the Capitol Police themselves were opening the doors for the protesters. No. Every single one of those breach points were opened by protesters themselves, but after they were open, there were occasions where the Capitol Police, in order to de-escalate, stood and held the doors open. Sure. They held them after they were opened by the protesters.
What was the timing on those breaches? You got 7 of them around basically the entire perimeter, right?
Yeah, you had the outer fencing and barricade breaches, first of all. The first one on the west side was like 12:52 p.m., and that was what they call a bike rack barricade. Excuse me. That was where the famous Ray-Epps breach took place. And a whole bunch of other interesting characters that have both identified and not yet identified that were in that breach point. And then there was the second line, which really was prominent in the Proud Boys trial that just ended, or the sentencing that just took place last week, is this idea of this small black semi-permanent fence that was shaken, and then the Proud Boys got a terrorism enhancement to their sentencing because they either shook that little fence, or they tore it apart, or they participated in moving it to the side after it had been broken, or whatever the case may be. If they made the mistake of putting their hands on that fence, then they got a terrorism enhancement.
Fence touching is a terrible act of terror. Yeah.
Yes, but of course we also have video from 2017, January 20th, when Trump was inaugurated, the barricades and the fencing that was busted apart by those rioters.
Oh yeah, that was democracy.
And nobody got charged with terrorism or anything else for that. So you asked about the timing. The first barricade breach was about 12:52. The next one was only minutes later, and then they moved up to the lower west terrace, and then the Capitol Police actually brought out more of that barricade bike rack fencing, and they set that up, and then as the Metropolitan Police were arriving, they were able to hold that line for about an hour and a half until the whole thing collapsed. And then that's when the breaches started happening up in the building itself.
Who do you attribute responsibility to for the breaches? You mentioned Ray Epps and some of those other folks. Was this an organic process?
It was both. There were people there that had intent. I mean, we've seen, okay, the fence cutter. Have you seen the videos of the fence cutter? This guy's still not been identified. We have clear, high-definition photography of his face. You don't show up at an event like that with actual fence-cutting tools. And he was methodical. He was caught on camera multiple times. He's seen very clearly. I've seen him from the Capitol CCTV tower cams. You can zoom in on him and you see him methodically going in and cutting the fence, because there was another layer of fence, it's called snow fencing, that he was snipping. And then you had other operatives that were picking up the bike rack barricades. And you had people that were going down. First of all, those bike rack barricades had a sign on it that said closed area. So Ray Epps was clearly, the photography of him that you can see by other independent journalists that were there on that front line. You can ask and question why they were there. How did they know to be at that initial breach point?
Do we know who they are?
We know quite a few of them. I mean, we know them by name. Yeah, they've made a lot of money off their videos.
Yeah. Someone might want to talk to them at some point.
Yeah. And so we know that these particular bike rack barricades had these closed area signs on them. So if you were at that initial breach point and then you participated in or even saw Capitol police officers shoved to the ground and then almost stampeded over to run up to the next fence line, then how are you not charged with a crime?
Or identified.
Or identified. But if you came over to the Capitol an hour later, and all of that has been removed, as we've seen from all the various video footage, one guy assigned, he was going down and he was ripping the do not enter signs off. Then the next guy is taking bike racks and they're taking them and they're literally hiding them. They're putting them aside. Then you've got the other guy snipping and cutting the other fences and rolling them up and putting methodically, then moving to the next one. Like that was his job for the day. And then you have the various basically crowd control agent provocateurs who are waving people, pointing where to go. Bullhorns, again, clear, high definition, photography of their face, still unidentified, directing people and telling them what to do. And these types of provocateurs were scattered throughout the crowd. So your question was, is it organic? Is it orchestrated? And of course, your main question is, who did it? I saw people of all stripes there that day. I saw not only with my own eyes, with my video, with other people's video, and I have a few axioms that I operate on, you know, in my life, and one of them that I developed that day is that I will never, ever, ever again believe anything that I don't see with my own eyes, but then consult the videotape.
Trust but verify.
Yes. And then since then, I've learned to consult other people's videotapes from different angles, because that can sometimes change everything. And so when you're in such a highly kinetic situation like I found myself in at 1:19 p.m. on January 6, 2021, and I'm not a riot chaser. That's not what I do. I've always said about my journalism that I like writing about the stupid stuff other people do. And I found myself doing the stupid stuff that day.
Yeah.
Now, the stupid stuff I did was not violence or property damage. I was just in the middle of this thing and then compelled by, you know, instinct to record what I was seeing. And so what I saw with my eyes was a small, tiny fraction of what my camera caught. But what my camera caught was a fraction of what the totality of what's being captured around me. And then over the last 2.5 years, we've had the opportunity to see that and piece them together and learn maybe that guy that was looking like he was doing good things was not necessarily one of the good guys.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what I think. I think you're a real citizen journalist. I don't know where citizen journalism is headed over the next 5 years. It's going to be an interesting ride, one way or the other. But I do think there are some white hats out there, even if a lot of them got sort of squeezed out of the system by vax mandates and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I think there's still some in there, and this is a time for courage. This is a time to stand up and say, yes, the totality of the circumstances, you look at this evidence, it's clear that something stinks, and something that is aiming right at the heart of who we are as a country, what our government is. I want to go out on a little bit more of an upbeat note. Tell us about the music. What are you working on? Where can people find you and listen to you?
Well, unfortunately, like you had talked about with COVID and other influences on our lives today, the music career that I have been involved in for, you know, my entire adult life, well, since I was a kid, has largely been kicked out from underneath me. I was making my living full time at music and writing as my side, my side gig. And then when COVID came to town, I wasn't allowed to work for a year and a half.
Yeah.
And so essentially the government weaponized me against them when they did that. And I went headlong into it at that point. I never wanted to do a podcast. I didn't want to, I just wanted to write. That's what I enjoyed doing. And it was something that exercised the other side of my brain, was doing political analysis and commentary, that sort of thing. I had no desire to get out and, as I said, chase riots and do the stupid things other people did. But I always wanted to eventually, grow old and die on stage at, at 90-something years old, for as long as I could do it. And I think that fate, whether divine or not, has put me in a place where now I've moved the music into the the co-pilot's chair in my life. But I have I'm a trumpet player and a vocalist. I've had my own bands. I've been in the music business for 40 years. I've managed major label artists, been a concert promoter, done all the above in my music career. But I had several years ago, I had gotten back into the performance side of music and was really content, to do that as not only my primary source of income, but my soul was, satisfied doing that sort of thing. And COVID changed everything, and then 10 months later, January 6th happened and really changed everything.
Well, it's just a great example, I think, of how you don't need to be ensconced in the Beltway to have a real impact on political life. You can be a three-dimensional person with interests and a full life, and still manage to intervene in what so often feels like a very tightly closed scene. Yeah. I think it's the most important story in America right now, and I think you're a credit to your country, and we wish you the best, and God bless you.
Wow, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Well, that is literally all the time we've got, at least until next time around. So if you found this conversation meaningful, please consider becoming a BlazeTV subscriber to help us create more content like this. Go to blazetv.com and use the code ZEROHOUR20, that's ZEROHOUR20, for $20 off your first year of BlazeTV. This is Zero Hour. I am James Poulos, and may God have mercy on us all.